I'm Professor Emily Contois. I teach in Media Studies, and I'm also TU's faculty in residence. So I'm coming to you today from my home in the Fortune House, and this is Ruby, who lives here with me too. I know that election season can be really stressful. Hopefully she brings a little bit of levity to our conversation today. And so one of the reasons that we'll be chatting about political advertising is because one of the areas that I teach in is a course called Advertising History, Culture, and Critique, and political advertising is often one of the units that we do, thinking about how we have advertised political campaign messages, political candidates across the 20th century, and of course into our 21st century digital moment as well. There are a number of platforms that will be important when it comes to political advertising this campaign season. Most of the money is still being spent on traditional television, and we look at the demographics of folks who turn out to vote, these older voters, they're the ones also watching some of our traditional sort of television platforms. But we are seeing more and more spends on digital, so whether that's different kinds of social media content and ads, or thinking about ads that are running on something like YouTube. They can be 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 6 seconds, so thinking about really brief political messages that are going into some of those digital campaigns. But don't count out things like billboards, right, at strategic places around the country, and thinking as well that every news story that you see about this campaign, about something that one of the candidates says, that's an ad too. It might not have been paid for, but thinking about promotional content all up through our media system as we think about these campaign messages. Digital advertising is growing and growing with each election. We tend to start talking about digital advertising with Barack Obama's campaign. He was one of the first candidates to be able to use social media in particular in a compelling way to connect with voters. But we've also had increasing concerns about digital media and how that type of the way we can niche target, for example, on social media platforms can cause some problems with political advertising. So while it can be a good thing to be able to target your brand new sneaker brand, right, to exactly the consumers who might like it the most, there are concerns of what it means to craft different political messages for the same political candidate and then be able to target them to different groups with completely different messaging. So our concerns about whether we still have a public square in a digital sphere are things that people are often thinking about. Misinformation is a big issue all throughout journalism, but particularly when it comes to issues with our political campaigns and, of course, political advertising. We have new issues with AI now, with issues of deepfakes, of what's real, so that might not be content created by a campaign, but could still be memes or content, right, created by lots of different sources that then circulates on social media platforms. It can be very confusing for individual voters to understand, and can also create a particular vibe, a particular sense of distrust, a particular sense, right, of what politics are like in this country. And so thinking about where your information comes from and whether you can trust it is actually a little bit tricky with political advertising. The FTC does regulate our commercial advertising, but when it comes to political ads, the regulations are actually a bit different, and there's a fair amount of leeway in the actual content that can be included in political ads. So even when you're watching a traditional 30-second ad, thinking about its tone, its content, what images is it using, what sources is it citing, and does it resonate truthfully against things that you've read from a reputable news source, are some of the things that we can all think about. The wild thing with political advertising is that research looking into whether it's effective or not is pretty murky. We have conflicting results, or sometimes we don't have steady findings for some of the questions that we want to ask. We do have some insight into whether, for example, positive advertising seems to work a little bit better to encourage voter turnout versus negative ads or attack ads about a particular candidate. And when you think about our particular moment in this country with politics that is so divided and quite cynical, there is a risk of sort of voter fatigue for the various messages that are part of political advertising, and maybe not turning out to vote at all. We're a pretty unique country in how difficult it is to vote, having to register, it's not a national holiday, you have to make a plan and be able to really commit to it to be able to vote. So the question of voter turnout is actually a bit different than what candidate voters are going to vote for. So it is true, there needs to be a political message behind just getting out the vote, and you often see that coming from each candidate's campaign as well, because that's a separate message that voters sometimes need to hear. So the timing of political ads can vary. The United States, again, is quite special in that our campaign season is so long. You might have been seeing political ads for any particular candidate for months on end. But as we approach Election Day, there's often a barrage of ads very close to Election Day. And the results are a bit mixed as to whether that helps turnout or turns off some of those voters who are undecided and are going to stay that way, and whether or not voters are going to vote. But we are unique in how long and how many different moments in the campaign cycle political ads can be finding consumers and voters. So one of the interesting things about the visual elements of political campaigns is that they often look quite similar. When it's a positive ad about a candidate, we're seeing lots of lens flare, we're seeing them with families, we're seeing them with people who represent the electorate, folks of different identities, different kinds of jobs, different areas of cities, rural areas, right, for example, that we're showing all sorts of different people with that candidate to try and create that positive association with that candidate, versus the totally different look and feel of an attack ad, right? Different kinds of filters, different kinds of editing, the scary voiceover, that is a very different kind of stylistic approach when we think about the negative ads. The other thing to think about that can sometimes be more interesting in the primaries than when we're down to just two candidates is looking at all of the visual signage, the logos, the look and feel, the colors that have been chosen for each candidate, that red, white, and blue is staying power, that's what most candidates choose, but it's very interesting when candidates go outside of those norms to choose different colors that have different symbolic messages, but also help someone to stand out from a crowd. I want you to go out and vote no matter what, right? This is an important election. All of these elections are important. Oklahoma can sometimes be frustrating that our voter turnout is some of the lowest in the country. So no matter who you vote for, don't be apathetic. Don't lose your faith. Don't lose your hope. Vote and then continue to hope and to work for this country to be as good as it possibly can be and for it to be the one that you deserve as the next generation of voters and citizens.